AEW needs more factions. Now, I know I will lose some of you based on that statement alone, but if you can slow your roll, grab a cookie, and lend me your ear for a hot second, maybe I can sway your opinion. If not, well, maybe we can just hang out, have a chat, and agree to disagree. I hear that happens all the time on the internet. So AEW, it has a lot of factions. Too many according to some people, but not me. See, AEW treats their factions similarly to how New Japan Pro Wrestling does, in the sense that much of the program's programming is based on gang warfare, even if it isn't branded as such. You'll have your top-level feuds like the Elite versus the Dark Order, and the Pinnacle versus the Inner Circle, but the undercard is filled with these kind of rivalries as well. You might see the Best Friends feud with the Hardy Family Office, or the Nightmare Family feud with Time Magazine's Men of the Year. Keep in mind that these aren't all going to be rivalries that light the world on fire, but the way AEW books their shows allows for more talent to be featured on television regularly because of their involvement in various factions. Talent like Wheeler Yuta, John Silver, Powerhouse Hobbs, or TH2 wouldn't be able to be featured nearly as much if AEW was full of only singles wrestlers and tag teams, because there simply wouldn't be anywhere close to enough TV time for everyone. There's barely enough now. Even when a talent that is low on the AEW totem pole does make an appearance on TV, like a Shawn Dean or a Sky Blue, they usually have their short match and then disappear from TV again until the next time they're called upon, and the appearance they do make is rarely connected to the narrative direction of the show. If this kind of talent is linked to a group, those appearances would be much more frequent and the appearances could hold a lot more weight. So with so much of AEW's roster already aligned with various existing factions, why does AEW need more? Is there no group of talent in AEW that could use more screen time? No area of AEW's programming that could use more focus? A women's division perhaps? That's right, the title of this video is slightly misleading. While it is true that AEW has a need for more factions, the need truly lies with AEW's women's division. I'm Tempest, hailing from partsFUNknown, and this is why AEW needs more factions. It seems like nearly every men's wrestler in AEW is aligned with someone. Everyone from Daniel Garcia in 2.0, to Christian Cage in Jurassic Express, to Death Triangle, to Team Taz, there are men buddying up and having each other's backs. What a lovely bunch of lads they all are. Camaraderie and all that. Meanwhile, the only faction in the women's division currently is led by Britt Baker with Jamie Hayter and Rebel in tow. Maybe there just aren't women in AEW with friends, but that seems unlikely, so I doubt it. With just this single faction, you can start to see the multiple benefits putting these stars together can have. First of all, it offers a much easier route for Jamie Hayter to get on television, so that's immediately a win. The same goes for Rebel as well. While her in-ring work is a bit, her work as Britt Baker's Scrappy Doo has played a large role in Britt's development as a character since her knee injury in 2020, simply by being a comic foil for Britt to bounce off of. Again, think of how much more difficult it would be for either Hayter or Rebel to get consistent TV time with AEW's stacked roster if they were both singles wrestlers. Does anyone remember anything specific about Hayter's AEW run in 2019? No, not likely. Granted, she wasn't being pushed nearly as hard as she is now, but that also has to do with her having a designated place on the AEW roster and in this faction. Britt Baker's nameless Chip Skylark Shiny Teeth and Me faction has provided these stars opportunities, but think of the vast number of performers who would also see their TV time get a boost by banding together. Stars like Sky Blue, Layla Hirsch, Red Velvet, Yuka Sakazaki, and even bigger stars like Riho and Nyla Rose simply don't appear on TV most of the time because they have no roles in AEW's ongoing storylines. However, if you give these women reasons to be on TV more regularly by aligning themselves with other members of the roster, storylines can occur more naturally. Look at it this way. There are going to be a certain number of segments on each episode of Dynamite and Rampage each week. These can be matches, promos, backstage interviews, brawls, doesn't matter. But think of these segments as simply allotments of time. Odds are these segments are going to be about the same length regardless if the performers involved are in a group or riding solo. A quick 30-second pre-tape promo will still be 30 seconds regardless of if it's Bryan Danielson giving the promo by himself or if it's best friends all standing together giving 1 or 2 lines each. So unless there's a narrative purpose for them to be a loner, like an Abaddon for example, you are literally wasting time by not loading these segments with more talent. Also keep in mind that this doesn't mean that everyone in these hypothetical factions needs to stand out in every one of these segments, but it would allow more performers to have little moments to add traits to their character and get over with the audience. Think Jamie Hayter during Britt Baker's holiday party, for example. She's not the focus of the segment by any means, but her continued unwillingness to follow along with Britt Baker's DMD sign-off is her own little moment that furthers her character in a subtle yet noticeable way. Having more women on TV in factions would exponentially increase the amount of stories that could be told in the women's division at one time. Let's take a step back from Britt Baker's crew for a moment though. If you look at someone like MJF, you can get a proper understanding of how AEW is able to tell multiple stories all running parallel to one another because of how they book factions. Here you have old Maxwell Jacob Jingleheimer Schmidt. He'll be involved in his major rivalries against the Darby Allins, CM Punks, puppies, and newborn babies of the world, and those rivalries will be the main focus of his character. This will be at the forefront of fans' minds if they're asked to think about what MJF is doing at a given moment, but let's have a look a little bit deeper than that. Alongside MJF, you have Shawn Spears, Wardlow, Cash Wheeler, and Dax Harwood. The Pinnacle, a seemingly united front. At the same time as his rivalry with Punk, MJF has also been teasing dissension with Wardlow by assigning Shawn Spears as his accountability buddy. This story doesn't receive as much focus as the main feud, but it doesn't have to. Instead, little teases can advance the plot each week, giving MJF and the Pinnacle more reasons to be on television and more ways to further deepen all of the characters involved. But wait, it doesn't stop there, as MJF also has a lesser running story where he's been loaning out FTR to Andrade El Idolo. There isn't a ton of depth to this angle, but the simple interactions MJF has allow him to share the screen with Andrade, setting up possible future storylines between them. It's a small thing, but even things like this go a long way in giving someone like MJF more potential segments in which he can appear on TV. Rather than just having one storyline to generate potential segments, MJF has three because he has multiple characters interacting with him at all times as a result of being in a faction. Compare this now with one of the best rivalries in the AEW women's division, Hikaru Shida versus Serena Deeb. Shida and Deeb have been having a stellar rivalry ever since Deeb halted Shida as she was en route to her 50th win. Their matches have been fantastic, but these are two wrestlers with no allegiances to other members of the roster. As a result, there are far fewer narrative reasons for Deeb and Shida to be on TV during their feud. Whereas MJF has three different narratives that he can take part in, these women only have one. This more simple storyline structure isn't bad by any means, but it does make it more difficult to keep things fresh longer, simply because there aren't as many possibilities for segments. In the case of Shida and Deeb, all they can really do together is have a match, brawl, and cut promos on each other. Again, not bad at all, but if you compare this with the vast number of possible matches and segments in rivalries between two factions, it's easy to see which rivalry has the easier time staying fresh longer. If both women had more people to interact with, those options for segments increase exponentially. I'm still of the opinion that the most important part of a wrestling show is the wrestling matches. That somehow has become something of a controversial opinion in recent years, but I stand by it. I like me some wrestling. So with that in mind, when AEW puts their stars in these big factions, you get possibilities for so many more match combinations, thus getting more talent on TV and keeping matches consistently entertaining and new. You're able to tell more simple yet varied stories this way, simply because there are so many more characters in play. Bryan Danielson can go on a murder quest and destroy the Dark Order before his match with Hangman Page, or the Trials of Jericho with Old Man Chris running through members of the Pinnacle. But you can also just put more fun matches on TV than you would have been able to otherwise, like Adam Cole versus Wheeler Yuta, or the Ghostbusters versus Bambi, Kratos, a Cowboy, and Brandon Cutler. This is one of the biggest benefits of putting talent in factions in AEW. Look at the Shida and Deeb feud again. There is only one person on either side, therefore there's only one possible match that you could book. But then look again at something like the Inner Circle versus the Pinnacle, with 5 men on each side of the conflict, and you already have 25 unique combinations for singles matches. 25! Last I checked, 25 is a bigger number than 1. That's just simple math that you don't need a degree from the Steiner Math Institute to understand. And that's not even taking into account how many more matches you can book by doing tags or trios matches. The possibilities become endless just by incorporating more talent into factions with top stars. On the off chance that we get a big 6-woman tag match on Dynamite or Rampage, it's so refreshing because it's so rare that we get to see so many women in one match allowed to have time to wrestle and all shine. So imagine if we got this all the time. If instead of only one singles match featuring 2 women from this vast roster, we put some of these women together into factions that fit their individual characters, and as a result we get more matches and more women on TV. If you take the current AEW roster into consideration, you can already start to group some names together into potential factions. You can have a wrestler's wrestler faction with Serena Deeb at the helm, paired with Mercedes Martinez and a newly heel Layla Hirsch, allowing the latter to have a bit more personality and learn learned from Deeb and Martinez while taking pins in trios matches and working her way up the ladder over time. That's just one example. You could throw together any number of combinations with AEW's roster so long as the talent involved are able to share some sort of goal or motivation. Have Maki Ito join Anna Jay and Tai Conti as the female side of the Dark Order. You're telling me you couldn't have some fun-ass matches and segments with Anna and Tai trying to be polite while Maki Ito is singing and bouncing off the walls? You could have an established vet like Ruby Soho take a couple of young talents like Sky Blue and Kiera Hogan under her wing and be a wholesome babyface group. And then when you start pitting these factions against each other, you would have countless matches that would mean so much more than they would have otherwise. Again, it's simple math. 9 singles matches are indeed more than 1 singles match. Is all this math completely blowing your mind right now? Wait till I figure out how to relate trigonometry and quadratic equations into wrestling, then you're all f***ed. Luke can claim star ratings or science all he wants. I'm using cold, hard math numbers, baby. Imagine a rivalry between Ruby Soho and Serena Deeb. Totally plausible and perhaps even inevitable. Now imagine the matches that could take place with these hypothetical factions. A Ruby Soho versus Layla Hirsch match would mean so much more if you could see the follow-up segment of Hirsch selling while Serena Deeb or Mercedes Martinez talk about their upcoming match with Ruby, because now Hirsch is actually part of a narrative. The same thing goes if you then book matches between Deeb and Hogan, Deeb and Sky, Mercedes Martinez and Hogan or Sky. There are just so many more ways to get all of these women on television in meaningful ways if you start putting them together. Again, these are just examples of hypothetical factions that you could put together. You could put so many different combinations together with the AEW roster, and all of them would serve the same purpose as any of the ones that I've listed here. Quite frankly, I don't see any reason why more women in AEW couldn't be worked into various factions. It would allow so many performers to get on television more often, develop and further their own narratives, and compete in potentially dozens of different matches, allowing rivalries to be extended longer and stay fresher. I cannot overstate how much this would do to further progress the AEW women's division towards being what the company had promised when AEW launched. Many steps have been taken since then, no doubt, but it is still too often that the only action the women see on an episode of Rampage is a 2-minute squash match. Let's add some more depth to this division, more matches, more storylines, more faces on TV, and I promise you the rest will come. I mean, as long as these women's factions aren't treated like the Factory, the Wingmen, or the Gun Club, I genuinely don't see a way that this would not benefit the AEW women's division in a major way. Does AEW need more factions that will help it continue to establish its women's division as being world-class and a proper representation of how great women's wrestling can be? Does a Bear Bronson shit in the woods? Yes. The answer to both of those questions is yes.